What if you laughed at the wrong woman and sealed your own destruction without even knowing it? In a room built for the powerful, they pushed her out like trash, sneering at the shoes she wore, the silence she carried. They thought they were untouchable, but beyond those glass doors, something was coming, something colder than fear, something that would erase every name they thought mattered, and when it arrived, there would be no place left for them to hide. The polished marble floor of the VIP lounge gleamed under the overhead lights, reflecting the polished shoes and designer heels of the travelers who lounged on velvet chairs and sipped imported coffee like royalty. And into this curated world of wealth and whispered privilege stepped Emma, dressed in worn jeans and a soft faded cardigan that clung to her like armor against the stares she knew were already following her every move. She clutched her first-class boarding pass in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the suffocating awareness that she didn't belong in their eyes no matter what the ticket said. The receptionist barely glanced at the paper before her lips curled into a polite sneer, the kind that said everything without saying a word, but Emma smiled politely anyway, nodding and stepping inside as if politeness alone could shield her from the rising tide of judgment that filled the room like static. She chose a quiet corner near a window, away from the clusters of businessmen, murmuring over stock portfolios and socialites tapping away at their diamond-studded phones, trying to disappear into the scenery, trying not to notice the way conversations dimmed as she passed, how eyes flicked over her sneakers, her thrifted handbag, her lack of obvious labels, like a checklist of reasons she shouldn't be here. A young couple nearby exchanged a smirk as Emma lowered herself into a leather chair, her every movement careful, deliberate, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might draw more attention. But it was too late. The whispers had already begun, soft and cutting, each one a razor slicing away the fragile armor she had pieced together for this trip. She pulled out a book, tried to focus on the words blurring in front of her, tried to pretend she didn't hear the sharp-edged laughter from across the room, the muttered jokes about charity cases and mistaken tickets. Tried to pretend she didn't feel the heat of a dozen judgmental glances burning into her back, but pretending only carried her so far. And when the sharp click of heels approached, when the scent of too sweet perfume filled the air, when the lounge manager herself stopped in front of her chair and cleared her throat in a way that silenced even the soft jazz playing from the speakers, Emma knew this small, invisible battle she had been fighting all morning was about to become a war. The lounge manager stood there, arms crossed, clipboard tucked against her chest like a shield, her expression polished into the kind of smile that wasn't meant to welcome, but to warn. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the lounge with a sharpness that made heads turn and conversations pause. "Excuse me, ma'am. This area is reserved for VIP guests only," she said, slow and deliberate, as if speaking to someone who couldn't possibly understand English. And Emma blinked up at her heart, pounding, lifting her first-class boarding pass with a shaky hand. "I have a ticket," she said quietly, but the woman barely glanced at it before waving it off with a theatrical sigh that drew soft chuckles from a nearby group of businessmen. "This must be a mistake," the manager said loudly, as if to perform for the growing audience. "These lounges are for our premium clientele. We can't have confusion among our guests." Emma opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat, stuck behind the knot of shame rising faster than she could swallow, and she saw out of the corner of her eye a young woman lift her phone, tilting it just enough to catch Emma's flushed face on camera, the humiliation immortalized forever before she even had a chance to defend herself. "Maybe economy is that way," a voice snickered from behind a newspaper, and another sharper laugh followed, the kind of laugh that cuts deeper than any insult. And Emma, burning with the effort of holding herself together, tried once more to explain, but the manager simply stepped aside and motioned to security. Two men in black suits approaching with the mechanical indifference of people used to removing problems rather than solving them. One of them tapped her shoulder, firm, impersonal. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave," he said, and Emma, frozen between fight and flight, between dignity and despair, found herself rising on shaky legs, clutching her worn bag against her chest. Like a shield, every eye in the lounge locked onto her with morbid curiosity as she was guided back toward the entrance, like a criminal, like a trespasser, like a stain being wiped clean from their perfect world. She stumbled slightly, catching herself against the wall, and someone laughed. really laughed, and it echoed through the marble and glass until it felt like the whole building was laughing with them. Emma didn't look back. She didn't trust herself to survive the sight. She just kept walking out of the lounge, out of the warmth, out into the cold, indifferent noise of the terminal, beyond where the cheap seats and the long waits belonged to people like her, where no one needed to pretend she mattered. She found an empty bench near gate 34 and sat down hard, her body shaking not just from anger, but from the exhaustion of holding every broken piece of herself together, staring down at the ticket still clutched in her hand, proof of a belonging the world had just refused to recognize. And in that hollow space between shame and rage, she made a choice she had sworn she would never make. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone, scrolled to a contact, saved under a single letter. Yes, and pressed call. It rang once, then silence. Then a voice low and lethal said, "What happened?" Emma closed her eyes, swallowed hard, and whispered two words that carried every ounce of hurt she couldn't show. They laughed. The line went dead. And somewhere beyond the terminal glass, where the black sky met the glittering lights of a city that thought it could humiliate her without consequence, a storm had already begun to move. Emma sat frozen on the cold metal bench. The boarding pass was still clenched in her fist, like a useless shield against a world that had already decided she was unworthy. The sterile scent of the terminal filled her lungs with each shallow breath as gate announcements droned overhead and passengers bustled past without a second glance. In that endless tide of movement and indifference, she could feel herself shrinking, folding inward, becoming smaller and smaller, until she almost disappeared entirely. But somewhere deep in the hollow space inside her chest, something fragile and stubborn refused to break. Something that reminded her every time she had been dismissed, every time she had been told she wasn't enough. She clung to it now, like a drowning woman clinging to the last piece of driftwood in a storm. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time blurring into meaningless ticks of the fluorescent lights buzzing above her. Still she sat, silent, waiting. Her heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the growing commotion near the security checkpoint. A rising murmur of confusion and tension made heads turn and cell phones lift into the air like a forest of curious antennas. She didn't see him at first. She only felt it, the sudden shift in the air, the crackle of energy that seemed to ripple through the terminal like the tremor before an earthquake. The crowd parted without being asked. A wave of instinctive deference carved a path through the sea of travelers. Then he was there, Damien Cole. He didn't run, he didn't rush. He walked with the measured, terrifying precision of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone. His black coat billowed slightly with each step. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even in the artificial glare of the terminal. His expression was unreadable, but so cold, so lethal, that even the TSA agents instinctively stepped aside without a word. Emma's breath caught in her throat. A part of her wanted to run to him. A part of her wanted to hide. Because she knew that the moment Damien looked at her, the world as she knew it would tilt on its axis. Then he saw her. His steps slowed for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the people nearest her to realize who she was. Then continued without hesitation until he stood directly in front of her, blocking out the noise, the lights, the laughter that still echoed in her memory like a fresh wound. He said nothing at first, just reached out one gloved hand and gently, almost reverently, took the crumpled boarding pass from her fingers, smoothing it out with a single flick of his wrist, as if erasing the indignity she had been forced to endure. Only then did he speak. His voice was low and deadly calm, carrying just enough volume for the nearest onlookers to hear. "Who?" he asked each word, slicing cleanly through the air, thought they could humiliate my wife. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. It was the silence of 1,000 unspoken apologies, 1,000 prayers that it wasn't too late to undo what had already been done. But it was too late. The reckoning had already begun. No one. Not the lounge staff, not the passengers who had laughed, not even the executives watching helplessly from their offices above, would escape what was coming next. Emma, blinking up at him, felt the first real breath she had taken in hours fill her lungs. Even though she had been thrown out, humiliated, erased, she wasn't alone anymore. Not now, not ever again. The weight of Damien's words hadn't even settled into the air before the nearest lounge staff stumbled backward, pale and trembling, their earlier arrogance crumbling into dust under the sheer force of his presence, and without waiting for explanations or apologies, Damien turned his head slightly, his voice carrying across the lounge with terrifying precision. "Bring me the manager," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to, because when true power speaks, it doesn't need to shout. The receptionist who had sneered at Emma earlier scurried away, almost tripping over the plush carpeting, while the entire room of elite travelers, those who had laughed, those who had filmed those who had looked the other way, now sat frozen in their seats, phones held halfway in the air, unsure whether to record or to pretend they had never seen anything at all. Emma remained rooted to the spot, her heart a wild drumbeat in her chest, watching Damien not as the man she loved, but as the force she had always known he could, but the man who had built empires from dust, who had gutted competitors with a smile, who had promised her once in a whisper under a rain-soaked awning, "If anyone ever makes you cry, they will regret breathing." And now they would. The lounge manager arrived moments later, a woman in an immaculate navy suit whose confidence faltered. The second her gaze met Damien's, and he didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't bother asking for her side of the story. He simply extended Emma's boarding pass between two fingers and said, "Do you recognize this?" The woman swallowed, her professional mask slipping. "Of course, sir, but there must have been some misunderstanding." There was no misunderstanding. Damien interrupted, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. "There was judgment, there was arrogance, there was humiliation. You didn't see a customer, you saw someone you decided didn't belong, and for that, you will answer." The manager opened her mouth to protest, but Damien was already speaking again, his voice lower, now more dangerous. "You see, I don't just own a controlling stake in this airline. I own the holding company that manages every lounge, every contract, every paycheck, that keeps this entire operation breathing." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "As of this moment," Damien continued, "you are terminated. All staff involved in this incident have been terminated. And this lounge." He glanced around, his mouth curling into a smile that sent a shiver down every spine in the room. "Closed permanently, effective immediately." The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft chime of an incoming flight announcement that no one dared acknowledge. The manager's face crumpled, disbelief and horror warring for dominance. But Damien didn't spare her another look. He turned back to Emma, extending his hand to her like a knight offering a hand to his queen, and when she took it, the entire terminal seemed to exhale all at once. Together, they walked through the lounge, through the sea of frozen faces, through the wreckage of pride and cruelty that Damien had torn apart without raising his voice, and not once did Emma lower her gaze. Not once did she flinch, because today she wasn't the woman they laughed at. She was the woman the world would never dare to humiliate again. Outside the terminal, the air felt heavier, charged with the kind of tension that made bystanders instinctively step back without knowing why. And as Damien escorted Emma toward the line of black SUVs idling at the curb, the scene unfolded with chilling precision, drivers snapping to attention, security melting from the shadows with earpieces and steel-eyed silence, because when Damien Cole moved, the world shifted to accommodate him, whether it wanted to or not. And Emma felt the weight of it all settling around her shoulders, like a cloak she had forgotten she wore. She squeezed Damien's hand once, a silent grounding tether in the whirlwind of control he unleashed without blinking, and he glanced down at her sunglasses, hiding his eyes, but not the intensity that radiated from every inch of him, an unspoken promise wrapped in iron. Within seconds, the lounge's regional director, a red-faced man in a rumpled suit, stumbled out the terminal doors and practically ran to them, papers flapping in one hand, his voice cracking with desperation, as he begged Damien to reconsider, to not destroy what took years to build over a simple misunderstanding. But Damien didn't even pause, didn't even slow his stride. He simply spoke over his shoulder with lethal calm. "You built it wrong. Now you'll watch it burn." The director faltered mid-step, watching helplessly as the convoy's rear doors opened and Emma was helped inside like royalty returning to her rightful throne, the door closing behind her, with a soft finality that felt louder than any shouted command. Damien circled around to the opposite side, slipped into the seat beside her, and the SUV glided away from the curb, like a shark slipping beneath the surface, leaving chaos and fear in its wake. Inside the vehicle, the noise of the airport vanished, replaced by the hum of bulletproof quiet, and for a moment, they simply sat there. The weight of the last hour pressing down between them. Emma turned to look at him fully, now the adrenaline fading just enough for the vulnerability to crack through her calm mask. "You didn't have to do all that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Damien finally removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes not filled with rage, but something far more dangerous. Hurt. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." His hand reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, with a gentleness that broke her heart wide open. "Because when they laughed at you, they laughed at me. When they disrespected you, they disrespected everything I am." He leaned closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers, his voice dropping to a raw confession only she would ever hear. "I can rebuild airlines, I can buy loyalty, but I cannot replace you." Emma closed her eyes against the flood of emotions that words like those unleashed, letting the silence between them throb with unspoken vows, far stronger than any public declaration. Outside the tinted windows, the city stretched out ahead, unaware that its pulse had just shifted, unaware that its rules had just been rewritten by a man who would move heaven and earth to ensure that the woman at his side would never again question her place in it. And as the convoy disappeared into the sprawling maze of concrete and light, it wasn't just Emma who had been transformed. It was the entire definition of what it meant to belong. While the SUVs carved through the city traffic with effortless authority, the full weight of Damien's retaliation was already crashing down behind them, because Damien Cole never did anything halfway. And by the time they reached his private tower, overlooking the skyline, the first press leaks had already begun, whispers spiraling into headlines. Billionaire Damien Cole terminates airline partnership after wife. Humiliated in VIP lounge. Entire lounge, staff fired amid scandal. CEO silent as Damien Cole moves to acquire controlling interest. And Emma, sitting quietly beside him, watched with wide eyes as the world bent at his will, not through rage or spectacle, but with the terrifying elegance of a man who understood that true power was exercised in silence, in contracts signed behind closed doors, and reputations buried before breakfast. Within hours, the airline's stock plummeted. Shareholders panicked, executives scrambled to schedule emergency meetings, but Damien's lawyers and financial teams were faster, cleaner, sharper. And by the time the West Coast woke up to the news, Damien Cole had secured a controlling interest in the parent company that operated not just that lounge, but dozens across the country, meaning the humiliation Emma suffered would now cost them billions. The second twist came not just from his financial strike, but from the stipulations he attached publicly to his takeover effective. Immediately, any employee within the company who treated a guest with disrespect, based on appearance, wealth, or status, would be terminated, and furthermore, all lounges would undergo mandatory retraining under a new protocol titled the Emma Cole Standard, named openly defiantly after the woman they had deemed not good enough. Reporters scrambled for interviews. Influencers who once mocked the nobody in the lounge rushed to delete their videos, and public sentiment, always hungry for a redemption, arc shifted violently in Emma's favor. Overnight, she became a symbol not just of wealth, but of quiet resilience, of dignity, reclaimed, of a world where kindness was no longer optional. But the third twist cut deeper than corporate restructuring or public applause, because when Damien offered to completely rebrand the airline itself, to erase every trace of its old name and culture in Emma's honor, she surprised him and the entire boardroom by standing up, smoothing her simple skirt, and shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "You don't fix cruelty by erasing it. You fix it by forcing people to face it, to live with what they allowed, and to do better." She proposed something different: keep the name, but attach a permanent foundation to it, one that funded scholarships, training, and outreach programs for underprivileged women who, like her, had once been judged by their shoes instead of their souls. Damien, for the first time in his life, sat back in stunned silence as the room nodded, as the decision-makers who feared his wrath now stood in awe of her mercy, her clarity, her strength. And as Emma sat back down, unaware of how the entire narrative of her life had just shifted from outsider to architect, Damien watched her, not with the possessiveness of a man guarding a treasure, but with the reverence of a man realizing he had married a queen long before the world caught up. The media frenzy exploded over the next few days, painting Emma not as a helpless victim, but as a silent force behind a seismic change in corporate culture. And as journalists scrambled to uncover every detail about the woman who had turned humiliation into a global movement, they found little to sensationalize because Emma didn't grant interviews. She didn't pose for magazine covers. She didn't chase the attention that came flooding her way like a tidal wave. Instead, she stayed quietly by Damien's side, attending shareholder meetings, not as a trophy wife, but as a voice of policy and reform. And the more she spoke, the more it became clear that this was never about revenge for her. It was about rewriting the rules for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, unworthy, in rooms dripping with wealth and pretense. Damien, watching from the sidelines, unleashed his resources to match her vision, funding the foundation Emma proposed, expanding it beyond lounges into hotels, restaurants, airports across the globe, and every facility that partnered with his companies now bore a plaque inscribed with a single mandate: respect is not earned by appearance, it is owed by humanity. Yet even as the world applauded her, even as corporations rushed to align themselves with the movement now called the Emma Effect, the fourth twist revealed itself in a quiet moment, far from cameras and boardrooms, when Damien offered her complete ownership of the foundation's operations, including the power to hire, fire, and restructure without needing his approval. A gesture of trust that few men in his position would ever make, but one he gave without hesitation, because he knew she would wield that power not with vengeance, but with purpose. Emma accepted, but on one condition: the foundation's headquarters would be based not in some gleaming tower among the elite, but in a modest building near the very neighborhoods most often overlooked by luxury's gaze. Because real change, she said, begins where the hurt lives, not where the applause echoes. And so, she built it brick by brick, hiring women who had lived the stories no headline could capture, survivors of bias, survivors of poverty, survivors of silence, training them to be the new faces of an industry that would no longer tolerate cruelty disguised as exclusivity. In doing so, Emma Cole didn't just rise above her own humiliations, she shattered the ceiling for thousands who would come after her, redefining what it meant to be powerful, redefining what it meant to belong. Damien, who had once moved mountains to protect her, now moved them to follow her, because he understood with a clarity few men ever reach, that true strength is not in shielding someone from pain, but in standing back and letting them transform it into something unstoppable. And Emma had become unstoppable, not with anger, not with noise, but with the quiet, unwavering insistence that dignity would no longer be reserved for the privileged few. It would belong to everyone, or it would belong to no one at all. The ripple effect spread faster than anyone could predict. Airports around the world began reevaluating their policies. Luxury lounges scrambled to implement training programs modeled after the Emma Cole standard, and CEOs who once prided themselves on exclusivity now bragged about accessibility, because public expectation had shifted in a way no marketing campaign could have engineered. Emma had not just exposed a moment of cruelty, she had exposed a cultural rot, and she had done it without shouting, without suing, without demanding attention. She had simply shown the world what dignity looked like when it refused to shrink. Quietly, she traveled from city to city, visiting lounges, retraining staff, shaking hands with young employees who looked at her with a kind of reverence normally reserved for celebrities. But Emma never acted like a celebrity. She sat with the janitors, the front desk clerks, the new hires who knew too well the sting of being judged at a glance. She listened. She asked questions. She remembered names, and everywhere she went, she left behind more than new policies. She left behind a feeling that maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't such a fragile thing after all. At one stop, an elderly woman pulled her aside, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you. I thought the world had forgotten people like us." And Emma hugged her right there in the middle of the bustling lounge, unbothered by cameras or onlookers, because that was the point. The world hadn't forgotten, it had just needed to be reminded. Meanwhile, Damien moved silently in the background, using his influence to cement Emma's reforms into contracts, mergers, acquisitions, ensuring that what started as a response to a personal humiliation would endure long after public attention drifted elsewhere, Because he understood now more than ever that legacy wasn't built on dominance, it was built on the invisible daily acts of respect and kindness that too many powerful people had abandoned. Together without speeches or parades, Emma and Damien rewrote the definition of luxury, not as something defined by wealth, but by welcome. And though many tried to co-opt the movement rebrand, it spun it into something profitable. The truth could not be diluted. The Emma effect was not a brand. It was a mirror, and every company, every lounge, every airport that failed to live up to it now did so under the weight of public scrutiny and shame. In countless terminals across the world, new signs appeared, signs that read, "You are seen, you are valued. You belong," simple words, perhaps but revolutionary in spaces once built to exclude. And as Emma walked through one such terminal, months later, unnoticed by design, her simple dress and soft smile blending into the crowd, she smiled quietly to herself, knowing that the most powerful revolutions are not the ones that scream, but the ones that whisper and are heard anyway. She had not set out to change the world, but she had, because when the world pushed her out of a velvet chair, she built a bigger table instead. Months later, when the headlines faded and the hashtags grew quiet, the legacy Emma left behind continued to shape the world in ways both seen and unseen, not in the grand gestures that grabbed media attention, but in the quiet fundamental shifts that changed how people moved through spaces once designed to intimidate and exclude. From the smallest regional airports to the grandest first-class lounges, the Emma Cole standard became a litmus test for decency, a silent agreement that human worth was no longer measured by shoes, handbags, or last names, but by something deeper, something no velvet rope or gold card could quantify. In one hospital lounge, a nurse paused before dismissing a woman in worn shoes and instead offered a seat and a kind smile. In one luxury hotel lobby, a doorman stopped his coworker from turning away. A young family with battered luggage in one crowded terminal, a teenager saw a janitor struggling with heavy bags and rushed to help without even thinking about appearances, because somewhere in the back of their minds they remembered the story of the woman who refused to be erased, the woman who sat quietly as the world laughed and then stood quietly as the world listened. Emma herself remained almost invisible to the public eye, refusing awards, declining interviews, avoiding every attempt to turn her into a brand. Because for her, the real victory was not in the recognition, it was in the change, the countless small acts of dignity that rippled outward stronger and longer than any headline could capture. One evening in the city skyline softened by mist, Emma sat beside Damien on the balcony of their penthouse, sipping tea wrapped in a simple sweater, as the wind tugged at loose strands of her hair. And Damien, who could command armies with a word, watched her with something like awe, still marveling at how the woman the world once laughed at had in the end taught even the most ruthless empire builders that the strongest power comes not from fear, but from grace. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and, in the comfortable silence that followed, Emma finally spoke, a truth she had carried quietly all along. Not every battle is won with noise. Some are won by standing still. Some are won by refusing to let the world tell you who you are. And in the end, she had not just reclaimed her own dignity, she had given permission for millions to do the same. Across the world, in places she would never see, faces she would never meet, a little bit more, kindness bloomed, a little more respect took root, a little more humanity returned to the spaces where it had once been stripped away. Because Emma Cole hadn't just changed the rules, she had changed the expectations, and in doing so, she reminded a world obsessed with status and appearances of a truth too powerful to ever forget. Again, the most beautiful thing about a person is never the brand they wear or the room they enter. It is the simple, undeniable fact that they matter. And sometimes the quietest revolutions are the ones that leave the loudest echoes. They thought they broke her. They only woke the storm. Emma Cole didn't need revenge. She needed only one truth to level their kingdom. Respect cannot be bought, but its absence can cost you everything. And long after their laughter died, long after their names were forgotten, her legacy would remain. A whispered warning to every room built to shut people out. Be careful who you dismiss. They may be the ones who decide your fate.